Josh Jacobs, he led the league in rushing 2 years ago. He's with Green Bay now. 7.5 rushing touchdowns. Too high, too low, or just right?
Are we sure he's still the same back that he once was?
This is the Lombardi Line with former NFL executive Michael Lombardi. Now here is your host, Stormy Buonantony, on VSiN, the Sports Betting Network.
A handful of running backs who are in new places in the NFL this year, and I want to get your gauge on some of their season-long props here. Let's start with Saquon Barkley, who goes from the Giants in an offensive line that has been a disaster since even before he arrived in New York, and now he's with the Philadelphia Eagles, who have one of the more elite units in the league. They also have a culture of winning in recent history, something that Saquon Barkley has not experienced in a while. The rushing yards prop, 11.25.5. His touchdowns over under 7.5. Do those numbers feel too high, too low, or just right for Saquon in this new system?
I think they feel just right. I mean, let's face it. He's going to get every opportunity. I think this is more of a philosophical decision you have to make when you go back. And when you look at the Eagles and when they lose to Kansas City, right, 2 years ago in the Super Bowl, they were the best rushing team. They were number one in touchdowns rushing, third in yards rushing. A lot of that came from Jalen Hurts. But Miles Sanders had 1,269 yards. Now, they have to go back to that offense. And if they go back to that offense and Miles Sanders gets 1,269 yards and Jalen Hurts gets 760 yards, you don't think Saquon's going to get 1,125? He's a better back than Sanders. Sanders had 259 carries in that game. Sanders had 11 touchdowns. Now, Hurts had 13. So I think both those numbers are just probably right at the price that you have them on. I would go over on the rush yards and I'd go over on the rush touchdowns. I think it's perfect because you got to compare an apple to an apple, Barkley to Sanders, because they got to go back to that offense. That we do know.
And Saquon said that he feels like a rookie again in some senses. And his numbers his rookie season, 1,300 yards, 11 touchdowns on the ground. I was just looking through the Giants schedule. And you think because of what they did 2 years ago that, maybe it hasn't been that bad. Saquon Barkley's only experienced one season of more than 6 wins. He's had a horrible offensive line the entire time he's been there. This is going to be a completely new system, rejuvenation, quality of life, I would imagine, in Philadelphia. So I'm with you there. Let's go to Derrick Henry. Similarly, goes from one of the worst run-blocking offensive lines in the entire league to one of the best, also a quarterback questionable situation, to a 2-time MVP in Lamar Jackson. His rushing yards props at 999.5, rushing touchdowns 10.5. Too high, too low, or just right?
Too low. All right, Gussie Edwards last year, he started 9 games for them. Okay, Gus had 810 yards and 13 touchdowns. And he started just 9 games. He played in 17, but he started 9. I mean, this guy's going to be the ball. They're not going to take him off the field unless they get to third down. Now, part of this number could be because last year we saw Keaton Mitchell come in and play really well. He gained 300, almost 400 yards rushing in the 2 starts he had. But this is going to be a pistol-type offense, and this guy's going to get the ball. And if 13 touchdowns is what Gus Edwards got last year, I can't imagine that they're not going to feed the ball to the big guy inside the 5-yard line and let him have more than 10, 11 touchdowns.
Yeah, I agree. And I know that there's people out there that say as Derrick Henry is aging, maybe he's lost a step. He still finished second in the league last year in rushing yards behind only Christian McCaffrey and a terrible offensive line. 1,459 yards, 12 touchdowns. He's only had fewer than 1,000 yards, which again is where this prop is at, since 2018. And it was the season he had 937 and 10 touchdowns in 8 games in 2021 and couldn't finish the season. Like that's what we're talking about here with these numbers. So I agree with you. I think they're too low, especially with the system that he is going into that was the top rushing offense in the league, just getting better with Derrick Henry. Josh Jacobs, he led the league in rushing 2 years ago. Last season, we know, took a step back in Vegas, didn't get the contract he wanted. He's with Green Bay now. His rushing yards prop also set in that same range as Henry, a yard higher actually at 1,000.5. It is plus 100 to the over, so you're getting the even money there. 7.5 rushing touchdowns. Too high, too low, or just right?
I think it's a little too high, and here's why. I think, is Jacobs the same back? His numbers were down last year, burst, all those things. But when you break it down, Aaron Jones had 656. A.J. Dillon had 613 rushing, okay? and they split the carries. A.J. had 178 carries. Aaron Jones had like 142. So, they're going to move things around. Now, if he's involved in the passing game, maybe that'll be different. But I think, to me, are we sure he's still the same back that he once was? I think the 5 touchdowns, remember, Dillon only had 2 touchdowns rushing. And guess how many Aaron Jones had? 2. That's why the number's 5.5. It's just right. They're figuring he'll add 1 more because we know LaFleur likes to throw the ball down in the red zone. I think you're worried about how much will they actually implement the run game. One thing we do know, Aaron Jones was a difference maker. He really was more a factor in that pass game. He averaged 12.9 yards average per game. I mean, he was at 7.8 yards per reception, which is very good. And Dillon was at 10. And now Dillon was catching checkdowns. But to me, Jacobs is going to be doing more damage in the passing game, perhaps, than the actual run game.
Okay, interesting. On the ground, 13 games, 805 yards last year. How about DeAndre Swift, after 3 years in Detroit, joined the Eagles last year, had his first 1,000-yard season. He now comes to what many believe is an up-and-coming Chicago Bears team, a team that needs a tone setter on the ground. Can he build off last season's success and go over this 800.5 rushing yards prop, touchdown set at 5.5? Are these numbers too high, too low, or just right for DeAndre Swift?
Well, I think they're too low because, I mean, if he's going to be the main back, right, and you take Fields out of the equation, who had almost 700 yards rushing last year, where are they going to get their running? Herbert is going to come in. He had 611 last year, right? They signed Deontay Foreman. He had 425. I mean, they're going to have to run the ball. And 800 is not a lot of yards per game when you break it down. Now, the 5.5 touchdowns, look, they didn't have a player on their team last year that had 5 touchdowns in the run game. So I would probably lay away with that. There's no way you'd get me to play the rushing yard leader. They're going to throw the ball. But I do think 800 yards, when you break that down over 17 games, is not a lot.
One more real quickly. Tony Pollard now replaces Derrick Henry in Tennessee. His rushing yards prop also set at 800.5, 6.5 rushing touchdowns. Too high, too low, just right.
I think it's probably just right, but or leaning on the too high side. For me, I wouldn't touch it. I'm not sure Pollard is the same back he once was. Plus, he's going to share carries with Spears.
Yeah, I think that's the thing that makes you question this number a little bit. I know he's had back-to-back 1,000-yard seasons, but last year, the explosiveness, talk about a lack of burst, right? The explosiveness that we saw from him the year prior, coming off of that severe leg injury, we just didn't see. He didn't look the same. And now having to share with an up-and-coming running back in Tajay Spears, it's a great point.